Hi, Jonah.
Hey, Will, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I am well. I'm a little beleaguered from the media book touring Baton Death March, but I'm delighted to do this. It's sort of like putting on a comfortable pair of shoes, because I've been doing the web TV stuff for a while, and it's a hell of a lot easier than sitting there with Alan Combs or something like that. So delighted to be here.
Blogging Heads TV is not a pair of wingtips. It's much more like a pair of well-worn Vans or something like that.
Something like that.
Well, we should introduce ourselves properly. I'm Will Wilkinson. Welcome all to my show, Free Will. And my guest is Jonah. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jonah Goldberg. I am I'm the founding editor of National Review Online and a contributing editor to National Review, a syndicated columnist, and a weekly columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and a terrific dancer. And
most recently, Jonah
most recently, the author of Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the Politics of Meaning from Mussolini to... The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning.
That subtitle keeps changing. It's hard to keep track of it, isn't it?
It is. It's tough even for me.
Now, Jonah, your book has been an object of some controversy.
Yeah.
I remember the sort of foo-for-ah starting about it, a year and a half ago. When the title was announced. So just the very title of your book was sufficient to raise a great deal of ire and indignation. I think that's actually something we should get out of the way to begin with. The title of your book, Liberal Fascism. Now, that's not a phrase that you just made up as a epithet to apply against your political enemies. That is a phrase from, who was it? H.G. Yeah. Right,
from H.G. Wells. Yes, for people who've actually read the book, they know I must say 50 times somewhere in the book, one place or another, I'm not calling liberals fascists. I'm not doing what the left does and using the word as a cudgel. And the phrase itself, liberal fascism, comes from a speech that H.G. Wells gave at Oxford in 1932, where he was looking to rebrand sort of progressive liberalism give it a phoenix-like rebirth, because he thought it had become too unradical, too boring and staid. And people don't know how influential Wells really was on the English-speaking left in the first third of the 20th century. Enormously influential, arguably the most important public intellectual in the English-speaking language on the left in the first third of the 20th century. And he tried to describe his entire philosophy going back 30 years, what he'd been driving at all that time. And the phrase he came up with was liberal fascism. He also came up with enlightened Nazism, which I suppose I could have called the book that, made even more friends.
Yeah, made even more friends. So that's good to get out of the way. You're just and we'll talk a little bit more about what your aim was in the book to make it clear what you were and weren't trying to do by sort of analyzing the sense in which politics throughout the 20th century has been fascist. Before we get too far into the book itself, I do want to say something about the reception of the book. I've been kind of just now it's selling really well. I understand. Is that right, Jonah?
That's right. It was for a while there number one on Amazon. As of this recording, it's at 3, which is a phenomenal rank as far as I can tell from these things, and it's opening on the New York Times bestseller list at 10. So I couldn't be
excellent.
I couldn't be happier about that. My only problem is thank you very much, but there's a shortage of them because they just didn't anticipate. Well, Adam Bellow, my editor, and I, we kind of were pretty cautiously optimistic that we would get a big reaction about the book. Clearly, someone among the suits at Random House wasn't, or at Barnes & Noble or whatever, and so they didn't order enough books, and so they were in a mad rush to print more books.
The problem is your publicist sent me 2 copies, and if they sent 2 copies to every reviewer, then they're just sitting around there.
That's exactly right. So probably one of your copies will end up on eBay pretty soon.
Yeah, because I'm sure the price is going through the roof. Now it's been the book selling incredibly well, but it's been quite variously received, and just sort of mocking you and the book has become something of a sport on a lot of left-wing blogs. And the whole spectacle of that's been kind of interesting to me because it really struck me as largely an exercise in sort of coalitional boundary drawing about sort of demarcating who gets to be taken seriously as a serious thinker. And it was because many of the people sort of mocking you for the book hadn't read it. They just saw the title and had heard a couple catchphrases like the white male is the Jew of liberal fascism or something like that.
Yeah, which no one has yet to interview me and ask me about that passage, which I'm perfectly happy to defend. But anyway, go on.
Because I will ask you. So that's something that our viewers can, that's a tease. You're going to learn about why the white male is the Jew of liberal fascism. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about the book is just to kind of allow you to say what the book is about. For one thing, and to let people know what you had on your mind when you were writing things that, say, have been sort of mocked and denigrated, and to see if you can, defend yourself adequately. Now, I've got some disagreements with the book, and so we'll get into that. We'll get into those as well. But I think it's really important to sort of reinforce a norm of intellectual civility in which you actually take things that people write seriously. Now, there are completely unserious books that don't deserve to be taken seriously, but I don't think this is one of them. And I, completely want to examine what the argument is and see how it stands up. And I think that actually there's a great deal of really interesting, really provocative, pregnant things, pregnant topics in this book that I think can kind of advance the conversation forward. So I think you might have gotten a number of things wrong, but in a useful way, and that's important to discuss. So that's my. So those are my prefatory comments.
Well, that's fine. I'm delighted to hear what you think I got wrong. Delighted to hear what you what you think I got right. But I'm glad to go through it anyway you want to go through it.
All right. So first of all, let's give a breakdown to the audience of what's in the book. It's a book of 10 chapters. The beginning of the book talks about first Mussolini and the father of fascism, then Adolf Hitler as a fascist and as a man of the left. And so this is where a lot of the controversy about the book is coming in, whether or not it's sort of legitimate to classify classic European fascists like Mussolini and Hitler as being on the left as rather than on the right, and we'll talk about that at length, I think. Then you jump to the United States, you jump across the ocean, you talk about a number of American presidents. Woodrow Wilson and the birth of liberal fascism is, I think, the most interesting chapter in your book. I found it completely, I learned a lot, and I was also completely terrified by it.
As a libertarian, I can imagine you would be. A lot of people have had that reaction, saying it's the best chapter.
Yeah, I think it was great. It's completely fascinating, and you move on to talk about Franklin Roosevelt and how the New Deal is fascist. Move to the 60s, talk about sort of student radicalism and sort of groups like the Weathermen and the SDS and things like that. You jump to Kennedy and Johnson. You kind of jump back a little bit in time to talk about eugenics in the sort of early progressive movement, contemporary liberal fascist economics, and then the Brave New Village, Hillary Clinton, and the meaning of liberal fascism. I'm sure that's not well received by many people. And then finally you talk about how we're all fascists now, and then you end with a kind of afterword about conservatives aren't free of all such fascist tendencies themselves. You admit.
Right. So there's only one addition. Amendation I would make to that summary is that in the Kennedy chapter, I have this long discursive side discussion about the social gospel, which I think has been ignored by a lot of people, and I think is really, really important, and we just couldn't figure out where to put it in the book.
Yeah.
And it may editorially not make the most sense to be in the Kennedy chapter, but it was so important to tell that I sort of had to do this big flashback. I just wouldn't want to leave it out again. So anyway,
why not under the FDR chapter? Because I've been interested in the social gospel. I wrote this long paper on the history of Social Security and the sort of ideas of social insurance in the U.S. lie largely with a bunch of social gospelers, a lot of these guys at the University of Wisconsin that you discuss, like Ely, so why wouldn't you have put that in the FDR chapter?
Oh, just narratively, it just kind of didn't work. I mean, we wanted to tell a story in each of the first 4 chapters. And the social gospel stuff that comes before... I mean, Social Security is not central to my chapter on FDR. And it's not central to in my discussion of the social gospel either. So it made the most sense in the Wilson thing. And as someone who believes that liberalism, fascism, communism, socialism, all these things are in most of their iterations and in most of their formulations intellectually, I subscribe to the view that they're political religions. It's an important thing to get at how religious progressivism was and how I think religious it remains. And I just couldn't figure out where to put it and keep it part of that narrative. So at one point we had a whole chapter just on the religiosity of the various sort of totalitarian orientations, and it just didn't work as a standalone chapter, and it ultimately just seemed to make the most sense in the Kennedy thing. You know, I think it needed to be said. Whether that was the best place to do it, I don't know, but we couldn't figure out a better place.
So let's jump back to the beginning real quick, and
sure.
Before we start anything, we should I should mention that your introduction is a discussion of what fascism is and what fascism means. Do you want to say real briefly what you think the definition of fascism is?
Sure. I think there are 2 points to be made there, which may anticipate some of our discussions later. The first is sort of a general one. I have a long one in the book. I mean, we can read it if we need to. But basically, I define fascism as it's a totalitarian political religion, although the word totalitarian doesn't mean what a lot of people today think it means in my sense. When I say totalitarian, I'm talking about holistic, comprehensive, all-encompassing and unifying, sort of totalitarian in the same way that Hegel talks about the state encompassing everything. So it's a totalitarian political religion that seeks to unify all of society under the leadership and guidance of the state. That said, it is not simply statism, because as we saw with how Mussolini conceived of it, how we saw things unravel with the progressives, the Nazi Gleichschaltung, which was coordination and all this kind of thing. It is not communism, because communism says that all institutions essentially have to become state institutions. And under fascistic regime, you do have some sort of semi-autonomous institutions. The point is that they all must point in the same direction. They must all be part of the larger project. And
now, to what extent is, I mean, because in my sense of what fascism is, the big distinction between, say, fascism and communism, they're both sort of totalistic, statist ideologies, but the big difference is that fascism is always nationalistic. It's always sort of tribalistic in a more sort of local national sense. So Italian fascism is about Italy, and Nazism is about Germany, and even the sort of American fascism under Wilson, people are calling that Americanism, right? And so there's a deep nationalistic element in fascism as opposed to other kinds of totalitarian collectivism, which, I mean, that's kind of the big split in a way in the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century politics, is between sort of different kinds of totalistic conceptions of socialist politics, whether it's going to be nationalist or internationalist.
There are a lot of things to be said about that. First of all, I agree with you in large part that sort of classical fascism, the hard nationalistic fascism that we associate with Hitler and Mussolini and all that kind of stuff, was, as you say, nationalistic rather than internationalistic, if internationalistic is a word. And that was the distinction that Stalin himself imposed on these discussions. The reason why fascism gets dubbed as first right-wing socialism by people like Karl Radek and Trotsky and others is because it was nationalistic. It broke with the idea of the international. Both Lenin and Mussolini, with the arrival of World War I, declare the international is dead because they realize that nationalism is taking over. And Stalin, he basically declares that all independent socialist organizations and movements must be declared fascist if they. And this is where he comes up with this doctrine of social fascism, which dubbed, Roosevelt, among others, fascist. all these independent socialist organizations must be declared, right-wing and fascist because they are disloyal to Moscow, not because they're capitalistic, not because they're classically liberal or anything. And remember you have Trotsky, who's eventually assassinated because he was allegedly the head of a fascist coup in the Soviet Union. So the use of right-wing and fascist against socialist movements is deeply embedded in a lot of sort of Soviet-era propaganda and also a lot of Marxist prophecy. And it's important to realize how vestigial a lot of this terminology is. But it's also, you're a libertarian. I think it's important to point out to a lot of viewers who may not appreciate this is that the semantic antipodal, the desire to put fascism, to put nationalism and socialism at opposite ends of a political spectrum makes no sense in practical politics. When you nationalize an industry, you socialize it. When you socialize an industry, you nationalize it. They are interchangeable terms when it actually comes to public policy. The third point I would make very quickly, I know I don't want to filibuster, is that this idea that nationalism was wholly owned by fascist movements is and A. James Gregor, a scholar of fascism, has been arguing this for decades now. Is wholly disproved by the historical record. Stalin fights World War II not for international socialism, but it's the great patriotic war for Mother Russia. Mao's socialism is the Chinese way. Kim Jong-il is a nationalist. Fidel Castro is explicitly a nationalist. Hugo Chavez is explicitly a nationalist. All of these movements are nationalistic and socialistic, and they are not contradictory, sentiments.
So see the thing that, and I think this is something that I was getting stuck on a little bit. I see what you're saying there. It seems like the Soviets tried to play it both ways. That when you're trying to generate internal if you're trying to rile up the natives, then you need to be a little bit nationalistic, right? But when you're trying to manipulate your foreign agents, right, they need to believe that Moscow is the vanguard of an international revolution, right? Because you don't want to think that when you're stealing state secrets in Britain or the U.S. for the Soviets, that what you're really doing is something for the greater glory of Mother Russia. You think you're doing something for the international revolution. So there's a
Sorelian noble lie at work here.
Yeah, so there's a having it both ways because part of but I think one thing that you bring out is that there's very few sort of sentiments that are as animating as nationalistic sentiments. The people are coalitional, tribal beings. It's easy to get them whipped up into a sort of a frenzy of some kind of solidarity or collective action under the banner of, the nation. And it's not really that easy to get people whipped up into a lot of excitement about an international brotherhood of mankind in the same sort of way. That's more abstract. And that's actually a problem that libertarians like me, like sort of globalist libertarians like me, have. So it's not very easy to get people excited about a global regime of free trade.
Right. No, I think that's right. And there's an important, as you know, there's an important human nature character here is that you need an enemy to define yourself against. It's one of the reasons why the left is fascinated with Carl Schmitt. His writings on the enemy. He writes, "Tell me who your enemy is, and I'll tell you who you are." That oppositional thing is written into our human nature, and that's a really important point here because I am delighted. I love doing the theory and the label arguments and where the intellectual lineage comes from, and I'm perfectly willing to defend what I've written on those grounds if you want to have those conversations. But I think there's an enormously important point here that has been missed by a lot of even friendly critics like Michael Ledeen, which is that you put the theory and the jargon aside, and I think this is something that a lot of libertarians should be sympathetic to. You put the theory and the jargon aside, and whether or not whether there's a huge difference between a Shachtmanite and a Trotskyite and all that kind of stuff. Love to talk about that stuff, but at the end of the day, the central insight of at least sort of my brand of conservatism is the idea that human nature has no history, and that the eternal problems of humanity will keep coming up. What Vergelen refers to as the metaxy, the structure of existence is what it is, and simply because we have new technology and we've progressed in our civilizational norms and education methods doesn't mean that we aren't born the same crooked timber of humanity we've always been. And so I think it's really important in a lot of ways to look at these questions anatomically in a lot of ways. And that's why Robert Paxton, in his book about the anatomy of fascism, doesn't get caught up on the labels and the terminology until the end. He's trying to talk about what these movements actually look like as lived. And, so Ledeen, for example, thinks that it's silly for me to call, his word is silly, it's silly for me to call Woodrow Wilson a dictator. But I think after you've given that chapter a fair reading, that it is certainly more reasonable to call Woodrow Wilson a dictator than it is to call any other president of the 20th century a dictator. Mm-hmm. And if you have a checklist of what constitutes a dictator, suppression of political dissidents, propaganda, censorship, intimidation through terror, you can just go down a list. All of those checks get checked off. And so simply because doctrinally in some way, Wilson doesn't fit some sort of paper tiger, understanding of what we're talking about, doesn't mean that to the average person, the visitor from Mars, wouldn't see a lot of difference. And similarly, the same thing goes with different distinctions between Nazism and Stalinism. I mean, if Nazism is defined by genocidal racism and totalitarianism, then the differences between Hitlerism and Stalinism are incredibly academic. Stalin was a genocidal, racist dictator, and totalitarian, and so was Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about that stuff, Jonah. Because and it's funny coming to this book. Partly, I think that it has to do with being a classical liberal. Like my sort of education through the sort of these libertarian institutions tends to be sort of a commonplace that socialism and fascism are just two different kinds of sort of totalitarian collectivist statism, and that the similarities are a lot more essential than the differences. Now, the differences are hugely
Hayek
important.
wrote this a long time ago, right? I mean,
and partly because one of the things that's so interesting about the response to your book is how attached people are to what they see as their lineage. It's like your family. It's like your family history. And if you think that there's some sort of skeletons in your family's closet, people resist that a lot. And so I'm proud of my sort of what I think is authentically liberal heritage as being an individualist, sort of constitutionalist liberal that has always and everywhere been against sort of totalitarian statism. You've always been in favor of sort of constrained constitutional democracy, and so that the left and the right in Europe were fighting each other over who got to be in charge of the totalitarian state. I just don't have a dog in that fight, right? I do think of them. So I was very sympathetic to that idea, but I want to get to the first couple chapters in your book and discuss why you think it matters. In the Mussolini chapter, I think it's completely persuasive that Mussolini was a man of the left. He grew up as a man of the left. He was an intellectual. He was a socialist intellectual. He's the editor of one of the most sort of, influential socialist journals, and then. Did he have a big conversion when he becomes a fascist so that all of a sudden he's a man of the right as opposed to the man of the left? Now, why do you think it's important to tag Mussolini or tag Hitler as being on the left as opposed to the right? Because I saw it as a sort of like, well, I don't want you thinking that they're part of my family. You can have them. What were you trying to do? Why do you think it's important to put those guys on the left?
I think there are several motives, and I've tried to be as honest about them as I can. One is simply to get the history right, and I don't think you're doing this in the slightest, but I've been astounded by the extent to which people have argued that the history doesn't matter. This is from the same crowd that thinks that Republicans are still tainted with racism because Ronald Reagan said something about states' rights and that Barry Goldwater said something about states' rights.
Right.
And therefore anyone who talks about states' rights is a racist, and we're all still racist. It's the Paul Krugman, Matt Iglesias school of political thought, and I find that to be absurd and ridiculous, and I have all sorts of reasons why, but there's a hypocrisy here that comes up when people all of a sudden turn on a dime and say, our history doesn't matter, only your history matters. And so I think setting the record straight is useful, whatever the record is, about anything. I mean, I think history matters. Secondly, there's a more personal one, which I think I'm very open about in the book. There is a certain spirit of, I know you are, but what am I? A certain of, I am sick and tired of being called a fascist. I went to Rodef Sholem Day School being taught more about the Holocaust than about Judaism. And the idea that somehow the political doctrines that I was, raised by my father learning, and that I've committed pretty much my professional career to defending and arguing about, are somehow related to the Holocaust, or somehow closer to what led to the Holocaust than, the people I'm fighting against, I find slanderous and deeply offensive. And more importantly, factually untrue and ahistorical and delivered in almost sweeping ignorance or bad faith. And I think it is entirely justifiable and worthwhile to sort of throw off that slander and say it's not true and shine light where it needs to be shown. So I think that's important. The third point I think that is really important for people to understand about why I go into this history and why I think that history is important is because if we all agree, if the single most animating and important lesson of the Holocaust is going to be never again, right? If we believe that the greatest, the greatest duty of all citizens is to be ever vigilant for creeping fascism, then it kind of helps to point out to people that they're looking in the wrong direction. It kind of helps to point out that, fascism was popular, that it wasn't simply this cabal of evil guys imposing it on a society, but that people actually embraced it as the wave of the future and progressive. And especially since the 1960s, we've inherited this idea that somehow whenever we see a sort of strong national security type or a guy in uniform or anything like that, aha, that's where fascism is coming from. And that's simply not true. It is often slanderous itself. The idea that somehow a cop or a soldier are inherently more fascistic than anybody else just simply is to me absurd. I mean, West Point is not a fascist institution, and to suggest that it is both slanderous and silly. And
let me push on you there for a second. So
sure. I
mean, like I agree that just West Point isn't a fascistic institution, but for instance, like what I felt was like the most sort of fascistic sounding speeches I've heard in a long time was John McCain's speech. I think it was in New Hampshire, where and this seems to be the guy's ethos, where the speech, the sort of moral core of the speech seemed to be that there is nothing higher than our service to the state, which he exemplifies to an incredibly high degree because he was tortured as a soldier, etc., and that there's something incredibly uplifting and ennobling about sort of warlike struggles that are insistence that we never back down in these kind of military conflicts is a sign of our blah 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 blah. But there was nothing in it other than what I felt was a kind of like sort of patriotic, nationalistic, militaristic grandstanding, and he puts it in a kind of charming, self-effacing way. But that sounds more fascist to me than Hillary Clinton going through a checklist of tax credits or the various ways in which she's going to regulate, add sort of labor and
sure.
different
I get
stipulations too. You get it. So
I get what you're saying, and I think part of the problem is that we have come to define fascism. Certainly, Hollywood has come to define fascism as this as this sort of strict militaristic,
It's guys in sharp uniforms and shiny boots.
Right, and that's understandable. And it is indisputable, and I think I argued this, fairly forthrightly in the book, that militarism was a big part of classical fascism. But I think the militarism thing is misunderstood. First of all, states have been declaring wars on other states since then there have been states, so at least, 6,000, 8,000 years. Mm-hmm. States have been militaristic for a really long time. States have been nationalistic to the extent that nationalism nationalism is a tough one to figure out exactly when it comes on the scene, because you actually had, these multinational entities before you had the sort of nationalism that we've come to associate with 18th and 19th centuries. But regardless, all of those themes predate the doctrines of fascism by hundreds of years, if not millennia. So it is entirely fair and justified to say that some of the stuff that you hear from McCain is troubling to you because it's militaristic or it's nationalistic and all that kind of stuff. That is not necessary. That doesn't get you nearly as far as I think a lot of people think it does in arguing that it's fascistic.
Right.
But
I think then the same thing is it doesn't get you that far in, say, arguing that Hillary's fascistic. I mean, because it seems
so let me make that case then. I mean, the important thing about militarism, and mm-hmm. and Brink Lindsay's book is great about this stuff. The Hidden Hand book. Is it the Hidden Hand? No, it's the Dead Hand.
Against the Dead Hand.
Against the Dead Hand. Sorry, it's been a while. What obsessed the progressives about militarism, and I think I demonstrate pretty clearly that the progressives were a pretty deeply militaristic bunch.
Yeah.
What obsessed them, what fascinated them with militarism, wasn't necessarily. I mean, obviously there were McCain types. I mean, McCain's very much sort of a T.R. Oliver Wendell Holmes type, in that he thinks the highest moral virtues sort of come from military conflict. Mm-hmm. And I think there is some of that in him. And I do think, as I say in the end of the book, national greatness conservatism, which McCain is the chief exponent of, is troubling to me, and is a throwback in a kind of right-wing progressivism. But what fascinated the progressives about militarism wasn't necessarily just wasn't the uniforms and the jingoism and that kind of stuff, although there was plenty of that. It was the concept of mobilization. William James writes The Moral Equivalence of War, this enormously influential throughout the Western world, not just in America but in Europe, enormously influential argument about how war is still the best means of bringing out the best things out of people, the best means of sort of organizing and putting steel and discipline into a society, and we need to come up with something, an equivalent of war, to have that sort of mobilization. And that's why you have people like it. Now, you said his name was Eli? I always pronounced it Eli, but I've never heard it said by anybody but me.
Me neither. It's one of those names I've read but haven't.
Yeah, so Richard Eli, or Eli, who was, as you know, an enormously important progressive economist, and in many ways the father of progressive economics, sort of the Milton Friedman of his age in a lot of ways for the progressives. He was fascinated with things like industrial armies. Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward, which imagines this year 2000 futuristic society, his ideal society, people are basically drafted into industrial labor for 30, 40 years, and then they get to retire. The Civilian Conservation Corps was inspired by this sort of notion, deeply militaristic. So it was the ability to mobilize society that really appealed to these people, and I think that's far more inherent in what I'm talking about, especially when we talk about this sort of anatomical sort of understanding of totalitarianism, about what constantly comes up. So, communist societies, Cuba, Soviet Union, all of them, heavily militarized because of the need to mobilize. And but that doesn't mean that if you can come up with a way to mobilize people that doesn't involve militarism, then all of a sudden you're off the hook, in my mind, for the charge of fascism. Because the important point is the mobilization, not the militarism. The militarism was just the expedient, the best vehicle for getting what you want. And William James, it's important to point out, Mussolini constantly invoked William James. He said he was one of the three most important philosophers in his life, and that's probably an exaggeration aimed somewhat for American audiences. But what is indisputable is that the intellectuals around Mussolini who started their philosophical careers as pragmatists. Giuseppe Prezzolini, Papini, who was quoted by William James often. These pragmatists were deeply indebted to James, and most importantly, George Sorel, who was in many ways credited as the father of both Leninism and fascism intellectually, stood entirely on the shoulders of James, making these sort of arguments, basically marrying Nietzsche's will to power with James's will to believe. And so and so Mussolini calls for all sorts of moral equivalents of war. He doesn't actually invade anybody for almost 15 years after he gets into power. But he does declare.
I'm completely sold and impressed on the idea that one of the essential things in fascism is one thing that strikes me as an almost dogmatic sort of atomistic liberal individualist. The thing that strikes me constantly when you're reading the sort of fascist literature is the way individual identity is supposed to be completely submerged and made instrumental to the collective project. And then the collective project is something that is, thought up and guided by the great strong man who's in charge of us all. And I really do think that there is a common thread between Mussolini and Hitler's kind of these sort of nationalistic, let's all band together. Individual. If you're not with us, you're against us. If individuals who are, dissent or I love the example from the so the same thing. I think you could see that in the war effort under Wilson, and I was quite persuaded. I was skeptical coming into that chapter, but I was persuaded by everything that you brought forth that there really was that similar kind of attitude that we have to mobilize as one people. The sheerly in the traditional sense of liberal the vehemently anti-liberal rhetoric about how individualism is a great scourge that has to be wiped out so that everybody can get with the program. And you have people spying on one another and people being arrested for saying why they don't want to buy war bonds in their own house. Things like that.
Also, it's important to point out, I don't want to filibuster, but the philosophers, the founding fathers of modern liberalism, John Dewey, is an important figure in American liberalism, and I love how dismissive, so many of my critics are at the idea that what Dewey said and did matters. Dewey is basically, the guy who recreates American liberalism, and he was entirely opposed to sort of, he was entirely on board with this idea of reshaping the individual, forging a new consciousness, or forcing people, in Woodrow Wilson's words, to understand that the new progressivism had to be defined as marrying your interests to the state, and all that stuff just goes down the memory hole, and I'm sort of an idiot, supposedly, for saying it matters.
No, I think you're right. So one thing that I didn't find in the book that I would have found helpful was more explicit discussion of the path of liberalism specifically. So because there's an obvious sense in which liberalism is just the polar opposite of fascism, and that's why liberal fascism seems like a confusing oxymoron. That there's the traditional notion of liberalism is something that respects the rights and autonomy of individuals, and the traditional liberalism is a liberalism, and therefore the state has to be limited to doing things that that preserve and protect the rights and privileges of individuals as against the state. There's a story about how liberalism changed over time, and so and this is probably just my biases as a sort of as being trained in political philosophy, but there's a strand of English liberalism in the late 19th century where the critique of classical liberalism is that it proposes merely formal freedoms. The sort of argument that the freedom to starve under a bridge, right?
Right.
And if liberal rights are going to have any importance, the state needs to guarantee that people have the necessary means to exercise their rights in a way that give them worth.
Right, from negative liberty to positive liberty.
Yeah,
right?
and so you get people like and it's interesting, and it ties back into your argument that the sort of English scholars making that argument, like T.H. Green and Bernard Bosanquet, if that's how you say the name, are deeply influenced by German idealism.
Right.
And at the same sort of period, that kind of German idealism is being transported across the ocean to the U.S. So people like Dewey are heavily influenced by sort of Hegelian idealism and are sort of putting their own gloss on it. Just as a complete bizarre trivia aside, one interesting thing that you could have added is there's a group of scholars. This is one of my favorite weird American intellectual history things. There was a group of scholars called the St. Louis Hegelians, and there was
that rings a bell. Yeah. Okay. Go on.
So I think the first whenever the Department of Education was founded, one of the St. Louis Hegelians was made its head, I think by Roosevelt, and they brought a bunch of sort of German idealist philosophy with them, including a lot of kind of Hegelian end of history state worship, right? That history is consummated by the liberal technocratic state. They thought that how Hegel had gotten it wrong was that the Prussian state wasn't the end of history; it was the American state was the end of history. Because obviously history progressed on since then, since we all came to America. So that's where Vanguard is. And they wanted to move the capital of the U.S. to St. Louis because Washington was too backwards looking over the ocean.
I've been to St. Louis and it works.
Yeah, but that group of people, they were in fact just mostly German immigrants. They're quite related in their sort of philosophical ethos to the Wisconsin sort of economics department people who sort of formed a lot of the intellectual substance of the New Deal, and so so a lot of American sort of progressivism in terms of the sort of New Deal style thinking does have a clear relationship to the sort of transmutation of classical liberalism to a sort of more activist statist liberalism where the state needs to be providing more goods so the importance of education in sort of Deweyan thinking can't be underestimated.
Right. Kindergarten was essentially an indoctrination program.
Right. And so part of that is part of it is, I think, a completely sensible sort of liberal idea that individuals won't be able to really exercise their autonomy if they simply embody the sort of prejudices of their parents. That there's something important about giving giving children an education in a way that just gives them develops their basic cognitive capacities in a way that allows them to exercise their liberties in meaningful ways, and two, that gives them a way of really applying critical scrutiny to whatever it is that your parents are dropping into your head. I think there's a real liberal argument for that. It very quickly shifts, though, into this sort of idea that we need progressive technocratic educators to mold the characters of young children so that they will be sort of dutiful agents of the collective project.
Which was what Dewey wanted.
Yeah. But that's the thing. There's a fine line. And you read some Dewey, it just sounds like the sort of liberal, we want to sort of give children, we want to develop their capacities so that they can exercise their basic liberties and apply a kind of critical scrutiny to tradition, say. And that's one sort of thing. And then just on the other side of the line, then you also get this sort of stuff about shaping souls to be, reliable foot soldiers in the collective march towards progress. And so...
Yeah, I mean, are you cricriticing...
I don't know. I'm just going off on a tangent because I'm interested in the topic. So we should...
I guess this points to, in some ways, a common criticism, which I think maybe I could have been more clear about it in the book. You know, I am not a fan of the current public education system. You know, I think that's a fair way to put it, and I'm very much in favor of providing sort of competitive pressures through private, vouchers, all that. You know, the usual agenda, the Cato agenda on public schools. I am down with, and we should call them government schools and all of that. That said, I don't think it is inherently fascist. You know, if you're going to use fascist as a bad word, you know, as a just sort of shorthand for bad, I don't think it is inherently fascist to have public schools. But I think that there is this, there's an inherent tension that you can't have one thing without the other, without risking the other in this fine line that you're talking about. I agree with you that there is a good sort of liberal in the best sense of the word argument for freeing individuals, you know, freeing children from the worst circumstances they inherited from their parents. And if you could do that by teaching them the 3 R's, that's great. Our mutual friend Ron Bailey, you know, he often talks about, how the SAT basically saved his life because he was a guy grown up in humble circumstances who was smart. And because of the SAT, captured that his merit, he was able to leapfrog out of very humble circumstances and make something of his life. Love that stuff. All in favor of it. You know, I got no problem with the best parts of that. But at the same time, I think that what you hear from first of all, I think it's worth pointing out. Let me back up. It's very much worth pointing out that the progressives weren't entirely or even mostly motivated by the good stuff that you're talking about. It was all of a piece. You know, the idea to craft a new nation, to build a new race, to forge this sense that your only identity comes from, as Crowley and Wilson and these others said, your only identity comes from forging your relationship with the state. Wilson says when he's the head of Princeton that the chief job of an educator is to make children as unlike their parents as possible. That stuff is an inherent risk of the good stuff. And they come together, and that's why we constantly hear, even today, all of these idiotic, PC stories about people, about public schools banning Lego because they cultivate a sense of individualism or, whatever it is, or that, the idea of personal property is racist and hegemonic and sexist, and so therefore the Seattle schools are going to get rid of it. Because the people who are attracted to the idealism that you're describing in the good liberal argument for public education are also the kind of people who have very serious and committed views about how to build character and to program young people with their biases and prejudices, and you really can't get one without the other. And I think it's sort of in microcosm, a good metaphor for an important point about this book. Hillary Clinton says she's a progressive. If Fred Thompson went up and said, well, I don't want to call myself a conservative anymore, I want to call myself a Confederate, the New York Times op-ed page would burst into flames with Bob Herbert and Paul Krugman saying, doesn't he understand what Confederate means? Doesn't he understand the intellectual lineage that he is invoking and that he's associating himself with? Hillary Clinton calls herself a progressive, and no one says jack because they don't know what progressive means. They think it has no negative connotations whatsoever, even though the progressives themselves had to abandon the word because it had been so destroyed by what they did to this country that they had to start calling themselves liberals. And I think it's vitally important if we're going to start getting nostalgic about the liberals, which is institutionalized in Washington with the Progressive Policy Institute and the with every liberal blogger calling themselves progressives when they're talking to each other. If you're gonna romanticize and deify the word progress and progressive, then we at least need to know the full story. And it kind of seems to me that you have a lot of people who are basically saying, well, we can recreate the wagon train out west. But this time, there's no reason to think that we'll have any horseshit. There will be no manure on our trail this time because that would be bad.
Jonah, you really were kind of losing me towards the end of the book. From the beginning, I still have some questions about Hitler and Mussolini, about just sort of how to but simply semantic points about about how to create a left-right spectrum, right?
Okay.
So most of those are semantic points, and I think there's a good point that say Mussolini and Hitler are right-wing, just in the sense that at the time the only things that were on the table as options were some kind of totalitarian socialism, and you could pick the sort of localist socialists or the internationalist socialists, and the sort of ancient regime types tended to back the local guy, and so in some sense that guy's on the right. Right, like, but I don't think that's very
it's
important.
fine. But I think I've written this a bunch of times now. If you want to call them right-wing socialists, I am fine. But in the American context,
right,
we don't call socialists right-wingers, and for very good reason. We are, you and I, in different ways, are defenders of an entirely different tradition. We're defenders of the U.S. Constitution and the ideas enshrined in the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, and that is supposed to be what defines us as people of the right, not necessarily conservative or libertarian, but just people of the right. And so you can't take right-wing socialists from Europe and put them in the American context and say that the defender, the heirs of Herbert Spencer and G.K. Chesterton and John Locke are somehow closer to a bunch of Hegelian, Marxist and non-Marxist National Socialists in Europe. So I don't think you can call them of the right if the aim is to lend ammo to people on the left today to call those people right-wingers. I think you're making a good
point about the sort of the way in which right and left are completely context bound, right? Because this very same policy can be a left-wing policy or a right-wing policy depending on the distribution of ideologies at any given time, right? So there's a sense in which the most sort of left-wing economic policies today are to the right of Richard Nixon, because there's been a consensus that's forged around sort of lower taxes, sort of an independent Fed, blah, blah, blah. But for whatever has happened, we have a much more, in some sense, libertarian economic policy as a whole in the United States now than we did. And that means that the far left is a little bit to the right of where the far left used to be, right? And so
I agree. The center of gravity moves, right? So therefore, the wings move with it. I agree with that.
Yeah, so there's relativity in what to call something, and I agree with you that if you want to call somebody a right-wing socialist, right? To some degree, that just confuses people a little bit, I think, because people think of socialism as left-wing, and I think you're right. It needn't be a left-wing. I mean, I don't even know what these things mean, and this is part of my problem, is that I find the left-right stuff almost entirely useless.
Can I go back to a certain anatomical point that you raised at the beginning that might at least, whether it helps you understand this stuff or not, I don't know, because you're smarter than I am, but it might at least help you understand where I come from in all of this. Earlier you said, this thing about how the left has this universal brotherhood of man or the internationalists did, and this raises a tension that you have as a global libertarian trying to create this universal consciousness and all the rest. I think that one of the, and again, I actually got this insight, the first time anyone sort of explained it to me succinctly was actually Ron Bailey. And I view all of the totalitarianisms as reactionary. Not just the racist ones and the nationalistic ones, but all of them as reactionary, because in my view, and I get a lot of this from Vergelen and from Robert Nisbet and others, in my view, it is the natural human desire to live in a tribe. I think you agree with that. To have that feeling of clannish and familial loyalty, the comfort that you have from being with your own, and democracy, modern liberal capitalist democracy, whoever you want to call it, that is a radical and abstract imposition on the natural desire of human beings to live clanishly. And so this false dichotomy about this right-wing versus left-wing thing that we were just talking about, that is almost entirely epiphenomenal and theoretical and imposed by communists who wanted to declare anyone who deviated from their definition of international socialism as being right-wing deviationists. And
maybe that's why it doesn't make sense to me, because I don't have any time for commie talking points.
No, I agree, but I think it's worth pointing out how amazingly these vestigial commie talking points have poisoned our language and even our dictionaries. But let me just finish this last point. So, fascism, Italian fascism, was reactionary because it tried to recreate that sense of tribal belonging, that sort of self-worship of us in the nation. And, the Italian fascists called it the sacralization of politics, and they wanted to give a religious sensibility about being Italian and belonging to the Italian nation. The Germans did the same thing, and so they came up with, instead of socialism in one state, they came up with socialism for one race. Mm-hmm. And communism is reactionary because it tried to do the same thing with socialism of class. It's workers of the world. They still had their us versus them, enemies who were the bourgeois ruling capitalists and all the rest, the reactionaries, the monarchists. They were all, could be liquidated because they were not part of the Hegelian quest towards perfection and the perfect society. All of those totalitarians are utopian. They all fit in what I argue is the Rousseauian tradition, even if I may be being unfair to Rousseau. I think it's a useful label. The general will comes first. The collective comes first.
It's hard to be unfair to Rousseau.
And so the only true radical revolutionary concept in politics in the last millennia at least is the Scottish Enlightenment Lockean vision that your rights come from God, not from the state, that you were born an individual, and that the state is essentially a transactional mechanism to defend your property, your rights, and all of that kind of thing. And I believe that it is entirely fair and defensible to say that the left tradition is the Rousseauian vision, and the right tradition in the Anglo-American context is the Lockean tradition. But that is not to say that all people who call themselves liberals are Rousseauians and all people who call themselves conservatives are Lockeans. It's more complicated than this. This is a distinction that runs through the human heart. All of us are a little Rousseauian. All of us are a little Lockean. And where we decide to define community and where we decide to define individualism often tells the tale about how to read people in practical politics.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's a lot of that I agree with, and a bit that I don't. We're getting short on time, so I just want to move on to just a couple other
fair enough.
things real quick.
I'll try to give short answers to your concerns or criticisms now.
Oh, yeah, no. Because I want to... we haven't talked enough about sort of contemporary politics or more recent 20th century American politics. And so I wanted to say that I'm sold on Wilson as being as sort of being the first fascist in some sense, and I totally see. I mean, I know it's sacrilegious to a lot of people on the left, but I have no problem seeing Roosevelt's form of sort of corporatist capitalism as having fascistic elements. The further away you get from that, though, as you move from Kennedy to Johnson to say Hillary Clinton, the more attenuated I felt it. And partly it was because that there was a dissociation with the full progressive program. And so I think there's a good story that's embedded in your story that tells us something about what today's Democratic coalition is, that there are a lot of elements that they've taken from early 20th century progressivism that definitely includes an element of sort of technocratic state worship and an idea of politics as being one of our most important sources of meaning. I think that's definitely resides in a lot of the left. But I think there was also a resurgence of some genuinely liberal sentiments, and so that the fight for civil rights and women's equality and things like that the emphasis on equality, on autonomy, on making sure that the poor, say, have a fair chance, that their liberties have a certain kind of worth. I think those are genuinely liberal sort of sentiments that are sort of merged with some sort of progressive technocratic elements, and that the Democratic Party today is this kind of amalgam of sort of progressive elements that share some commonalities with fascism, but that's been watered down so much and married with genuinely liberal sentiments that it does seem a little bit tendentious to call sort of Hillary Clinton fascist, even when she's talking about the politics of meaning or going off about how important, like collective drive to tackle children's illiteracy or whatever she's talking about in the day. I mean, so I wanted to, other than just sort of, because I'm on your page in the early parts of the book about just saying how it is, and again, like I clearly have some semantic differences with you about how to do the labeling, but as far as just saying that there is this really strong sort of collectivist, totalitarian element in the progressive movement that people are now, at least because people are going back to the term progressive, becoming somewhat romantic about. It's really important to tell the truth about what the full truth about the American progressive movement, which I think you're right has is pretty close to fascist as anything apart from Mussolini himself. But it seems like that's been really watered down. And likewise, like in the conservative movement, I would like to believe that the American conservative movement is largely just the party of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but it's not. I mean, that part of the real story of American politics in the 20th century is, say, how the Southern Coalition shifted from being basically the electoral heft behind the New Deal, which is why most New Deal policies were explicitly racist in the way that they were applied, because Roosevelt needed the Southern coalition to be behind his political programs. But that, with the advent of civil rights, with Civil Rights Act, that sort of those people started shifting right, and so today the American Conservative Party is partly sort of vestigially anti-communist. Some of it is just kind of patriotic and nativist. Some of it cares a lot about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. But when you really look at, when I look at what the Constitution of left and right are in the U.S., they both seem like to me kind of ugly amalgams of good and bad things. So, I mean, I wasn't very articulate there, but that's my overall assessment.
I think I probably agree with 95% of that. I mean, I think it's really important for me to at least tell the most hostile viewers or readers or critics who are still open-minded enough to be persuaded at least a little bit about where I'm coming from. I don't really care very much about the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. I care very much about conservatism. I'm proud to call myself conservative. I don't take any particular pride in calling myself a Republican. And at the end of the book, I point out that Pat Buchanan, has some deeply fascistic attitudes about government and all of the rest. And in compassionate conservatism comes in for a terrible drubbing. TR comes in for a drubbing. I consider Nixon to be a terrible guy, and by my lights, the last progressive president. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I got no problem, with you saying that the parties are amalgams of good and bad. I also think the worst thing that National Review ever did, and the worst thing that the conservative movement ever did, was stand in the way of the Civil Rights Act. I think that is, it is our original shame and sin, and Goldwater was absolutely right to regret it later. And one of the great tragedies is how it's discredited what I think is the essential question of federalism, mm-hmm. For maximizing human happiness. I think it is an incredibly important thing, and it did lasting and almost probably permanent damage to the idea of subsidiarity in our society. So, but I agree with you on all that. I think the Democrats were on the right side of the Civil Rights Act. Well, I should say the liberals were, because the Democrats actually were outvoted by the Republicans on the Civil Rights Act quite often. But, so the left, writ large, was right on the civil rights stuff and all that kind of thing. That's fine. That said, it tells you, I didn't choose to write about Hillary Clinton because of, a desire to sort of score points with the main boogeyman of the right. I think that she's, in fact, the best example of what I am talking about. And I agree with you that there are liberal elements on the Democratic side. I have plenty of friends who are liberals who I don't think are liberal fascists or any of that kind of stuff. And but I think, if you're looking at the long-term point of the book, which is to correct the record and to properly place fascism on the intellectual side of the scale, I think it makes a lot of sense to make the point, or to point out the family resemblances that pop up on the left, because we are so, the entire chattering class, from the New York Review of Books to the New York Times to the New Republic to the Nation, all of these places, they have got their binoculars and telescopes pointed at the right, looking for every vague sign of incipient fascism. I mean, I got this guy, Dave Newert, who's reviewed the book for the American Prospect, who is just apoplectic that I am not obsessed with the posse comitatus. And my initial reaction is, who gives a rat's ass about the posse comitatus? I mean,
right.
what I'm trying to point out is that there are all sorts of things embedded in what we consider to be good and decent politics that actually have deep and significant resemblances to the source of politics that lead to what we've been told for the last 75 years is the signature evil expression of politics in human life, which is fascism. And so the politics of unity, the cult of unity, the cult of leadership that we've gotten on the left goes completely unquestioned and unlooked at. And if you read It Takes a Village, which I don't know if you have, but I mean, I'm like one of the 4 conservatives in captivity who actually read that damn piece of doggerel, and it is, P.J. O'Rourke, great essay if you ever have a chance to read it. Reviewed it for the Weekly Standard, and he was the one who first pointed out how fascistic it was. He actually just took out the Columbia Encyclopedia and looked up the definition of fascism and compared it to It Takes a Village, and it is sweeping in there. And I think what so many people are getting hung up on, what Fred Siegel got hung up on in the Wall Street Journal, what a lot of left-wing bloggers, is they can't. It's the cognitive dissonance that they've got simply will not let go of the word fascist as just simply evil. And so therefore it is terrible to call anything they like evil. But I'm not using fascist in that way. The word socialist doesn't have that connotation, even though more people were murdered and slaughtered.
Even though it ought to. Yeah, I want to point people to. If I can point, just like mention something that maybe we can get a link to, if I can find it. There's an amazing essay by Alan Kors at the University of Pennsylvania on the sort of moral obligation of the left to take responsibility for complicity in this socialist atrocities in the 20th century. And it's an incredibly damning essay, and I agree with you that there's a lot of the left's history that gets airbrushed, and it's right to bring it out. And I think it's right to bring out the skeletons out of the rights closet. I want them all to come out. So,
but there's an
because
industry.
I think it helps. I think bringing all that out helps to reinforce the crucial importance of liberal individualism. Like all the really hoary stuff on all the terrifying stuff on both sides just reaffirms the importance of liberal individualism. And there is a lot of skeletons in the closet in terms of the allegiances of today's sort of left-wing communitarians. I agree with you. Their ancestry isn't as sainted as many would like to portray them. So.
Right. I think one of the more important chapters in the book is actually the chapter on eugenics and about how deeply tied it was to the progressive project of building the welfare state. But I also think, if we're going to do this, it's also worth pointing out how, again, nowhere in the book, I say it explicitly many times, nowhere do I say that I think liberals are going to put us on a path to death camps in the Holocaust. That's just not what I'm saying. You
actually say, this is one of the things that I think made some of the people suspicious of the book. You go to so much trouble to say that I'm not saying that today's liberals are like Hitler, that you say it so much that I think people suspect, like, oh yeah, he keeps telling us that he's not doing that, but he's really trying to subtly do that.
Well, but the problem is that our hackles get raised so much by ad Hitlerum arguments, in Godwin's law and all that kind of stuff, that if I'm going to try and reclaim and reclaim some meaning for the word fascist and explain, that fascism is not synonymous with racism, for example. I mean, the Italian fascists were not anti-Semitic. They did enormous things to save Jewish lives. Those kinds of things. You've got to sort of keep warning the reader, showing them a road sign, saying, "Calm down, don't worry. This is not I'm not doing what you think I'm doing." But I do think it's worth pointing out, if we're going to have links, I forgot Blogging Head does links, there was a fascinating essay in the Claremont Review of Books called "The Economists and the Death Camps." And really, it was a review, I think, of Goethe's allies' work on Nazism and all the rest. Absolutely fascinating argument that in many ways the final solution, I don't want to say it doesn't come out of genocidal racism, because obviously the racism was central to the Nazi worldview, but the actual moving towards the liquidation of the Jews was in a lot of respects the ineluctable consequence of young social planners, economists looking at society as a series of sort of resource allocation problems. And population density problems and the rest. And it just eventually, the solution came to be, to get rid of the problem. And that, I think, is as I say, and I truly do believe this, the most fascistic thing said on American campuses and in polite society in America among activists is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Because to look at people who disagree with you as a problem in that sense is leads to a logic that is really dangerous. And it's the logic that, at least according to this essay in the Claremont Review of Books, led to the liquidation of Jews. And again, I'm not saying that we're going that way, but we can come really, really far short of the Holocaust and still be going to a bad place.
Yeah. Well, Jonah, I've gone way over time, but I made a promise to viewers. The white male is the Jew of liberal fascism. So you've got 1 minute to explain.
Okay, well, this sort of ties into it. In much the same way that the progressive mindset of resource allocation contributed to the Holocaust. One of the other things that contributed to the Holocaust, and there's a phenomenal book. It really, it's a scandal it didn't get more attention by a very serious Holocaust scholar of Germany, Jeffrey Herf, called the Jewish Enemy. The Nazis, the biological racism stuff has been so well trod and well covered. What has gotten much less attention is that they were populist conspiracy theorists. They were paranoid, and suffused throughout Nazi propaganda was this idea that there were these powerful capitalistic forces, and they were capitalists, running, pulling strings, deciding things for people, sitting in a star chamber, ruining their food, ruining their culture, and all of the rest. That paranoia, which I think I think you'll agree, is sort of also hardwired into human nature, still pops up, and where we see it the most in our popular culture is in this demonization of the white heterosexual male. He has rigged the system. The system is logocentric. The system is, going back to Charles Beard, designed to benefit rich white guys. And you can go throughout Hollywood's oeuvre. You can go through, all sorts of movies and television shows. You can go through the course catalogs at Yale and Harvard, and things like whiteness studies. It's all about how these dead white European males, these evil pale penis people, are controlling things from behind the scenes, pulling strings, setting up the system to put the brown man and the black man against each other, to keep women down, glass ceilings, all of the rest. That paranoia, that idea that somehow the whole system is rigged to benefit a specific ethno-cultural group, to me, is amazingly reminiscent of the arguments you heard from Nazis about Jews. And obviously no one's talking about... Well, actually, I shouldn't say no one's talking about liquidating white people. The entire academic discipline of whiteness studies is expressly aimed at getting rid of the concept of whiteness. But...
that getting rid of concepts isn't as bad as getting... Well, there you have it, folks. We're really over time, Jonah, so that's where we have to leave it. Maybe there's, maybe there's something to the idea that the system is rigged, but it's not a conspiracy in the way that people would make it out. But in any case, let's...
Anyway, Will, I'm delighted to do it. I hope we can talk again. I'm a big fan of your stuff, and thanks for having me.
It was great, Jonah. Stimulating liberal fascism, the book that many love to hate, but it's stimulating and worth your time. Thanks, Jonah, and best of luck with the book and the rest of the tour.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Will.
All right.
Talk to you later.